So it sounds like one way you think is to increase the power of the chairs of the committees and maybe some internal mechanisms within committees to allow the junior members of the committee to have a bigger say into what's happening in the committee.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's always a tough one, and it's never sort of been the case that the backbenchers have a ton of power. But we have seen sort of the ebb and flow of subcommittees, and again, you can get lost here pretty quickly into a devolution of power that becomes, too clumsy to handle. But the more members of Congress that are in a position to actually influence politics by acting in the congressional sphere, rather than just trying to position take or influence the public sphere, which again, I think is important, but fewer and fewer members have sort of the ability to act in the actual legislative sphere and are reduced to sort of acting in the public sphere. And that often just takes the form of position taking or credit claiming and things like that.
Yeah, that's actually something I want to dig a little bit deeper on with you, is this concept of the public sphere and in the public eye versus, private kinds of discussions and negotiations. On the one side, there's this idea of having perfect transparency, right, of what everyone in Congress is doing and thinking and saying. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, there's an argument to be made, but that in such a circumstance, no compromise can ever happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can't build relationships, and no good policy is ever going to get made because everyone's going to be trying to be a purist for their base at home rather than get compromise done and do what other people think politics means, which is compromise. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about your opinion on this idea of, this concept of privacy and, kind of closed discussion debate versus something that's open for the public.
I tend to fall on the side that, transparency, while it has its merits, has probably gone too far in Congress, and that members could probably use a little more space to negotiate in private and cut deals in private. Now, I think there's a little bit of nuance to this. And one is that it's not that transparency is itself bad, it's that it doesn't seem to achieve its objectives. And opening up sort of like the committee markups is a great example of this. In the 1970s, most committee markups were not held publicly, they were private. And so in the committee, you were altering bills and amendments would be put in committee to change the bill, and it would come out and you wouldn't really know who did it, and people could tell you, but it wasn't sort of a public debate. And now the committee markups are open to the public, and then there was benefits of that. Everyone can be in there and see what happens. But it has shifted a lot of the real debate and the real markup just further into the recesses, into an unstructured process, which then can be almost more easily controlled by the leadership. And there's, a broad shift towards theater in the committee markup system, and sort of a lot of pressure not to get out of line as a backbencher in those committee markups. And if you are, to be labeled as a rebel or an outcast or things like that, or to make it sort of a big public fight. And now I think public sphere politics are important. A lot of people poo-poo credit claiming and position taking and things like that, but I think the public sphere is where sort of the meaning of politics is shaped largely. And so I don't think it's like wild that freshman members of Congress who feel like they have no power are working on building their public sphere power by getting 1 million Instagram followers like AOC or others. And I think that's a real place to use agenda leverage, right? Is to just move the public. But, I do think that, for the most part, members have been inundated with a public sphere that's creeped more and more into the institution. Now, of course, I'm not a believer in closing the doors of Congress. I think, I do think that actual sort of deliberation on the floor is obviously a public fight, and all the votes should be known and everyone should be talking in public, and that's part of the deal. But I also do think that, not just sort of how we've changed things institutionally with transparency laws, but the nature of the public sphere has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And one example of this that I have studied and continue to study is how sort of social media and the explosion of the information environment has changed sort of the needs of the members and the practice of politics on the Hill. And here, I think it's undoubtedly been a negative in a lot of ways. First is that members don't have any room to hide from public knowledge. And that sounds like, well, why would they need room to hide from public knowledge? But, 25 years ago, if you were going to take a vote in a subcommittee on an amendment to a bill, you just took the vote. And if you want to get mad about you later at it, they got mad about you later, and you'd explain it to them or whatnot. Now, before an amendment goes through in a committee, right, you have thousands of people on social media screaming at members how to vote about them, and members need to take this into consideration ahead of time as they head into vote for. And it's a lot of pressure on people, right? These are amendments that the members of Congress, may not be ready to explain or thinking about or have a position on, and that leads them, I think, in a lot of cases, to default to sort of partisan cues, to play it safe in a risk-averse way. And more generally speaking, just sort of the low cost, massive volume of electronic communications has members thinking more and more about the public sphere as they go about the legislative job, which means short-term considerations, particularly in the House, are becoming even more paramount. People find about everything instantaneously, and you need to have an answer to everything instantaneously, and it's got to be quick. And that sort of information environment, I don't think is great for sort of independent deliberative thinking by members, because it does encourage you to sort of not stand out and be risk averse and just stay with the herd so that you don't get yelled at on the internet. But it also forces members to expend their resources dealing with the public sphere to a degree that no one could have fathomed when I was first working in Congress. I think in 1995, the last year before the email, there were something like 50 million letters sent to the House of Representatives, which is a lot of letters. But I think, in recent years, we're talking about, 1 to 1.5 billion emails coming into the House with no corresponding increase in staffing resources. And so if members want to maintain sort of a public relations image with their constituents that is comparable of those times, guess what? The resources are shifting towards dealing with sort of that public sphere and constituents, and away from policy expertise and things that could aid them if they wanted to sort of step in seriously and act in the deliberative process. And the leaders are all for this, right? Because members can just focus on the constituent stuff, and then they can take their cues from the leaders on policy. I mean, leaders can be happier about this in any way, right? It just means that members are more and more willing to outsource policymaking to the party, to the leadership, and to others who prevent them from being sort of annoying deliberative actors. But from my point of view, or perhaps our point of view, people engaging in sort of a healthy form of legislating.
Yeah, and the other big problem with all the social media or any kind of media is that a lot of the members, it would seem to me a very difficult task to really understand the non-vocal part of their voter base, right? I mean, the media has the effect of magnifying a certain subset of their district's point of view, right? Yeah. And that other part is lost. And in some ways, maybe they're getting a more distorted view of their district than they would have in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I studied this a little at CRS, and I've studied it a little bit since, is that the effect of electronic media on sort of how a member understands their own district has some really fascinating features. One is that it's a lot harder to know if the stuff is even coming from your district anymore. And members try all they can to make sure stuff is coming from their district. They require you to put in an address if you want to, connect with them officially, but those are easily defeated. And members may not believe it, but I'm sure there are spam bots doing it. And so you're getting sort of a more nationalized view, at the very least, of politics for members. That if they're what does the mail say was the oldest question in a member's office a generation ago. What does the mail say about this? And now the mail's more nationalized. It just is. People are sending you stuff and you can't tell where it's from. The other feature of that is that the reduced cost of contacting Congress has flattened sort of like the intensity preference. Like, members kind of always knew that their mail wasn't representative of their district, but they also knew that the mail they were getting was an intense minority, right? The kind of people who would go tell 100 people, that you're an awful congressman, or that we're going to go out and campaign against you or spend money on politics. And so even if it wasn't perfectly representative of your district, it was representative of something important. And now it's not clear what it's representative of, given that the marginal cost of contacting Congress is financially zero and time-wise very small too. You don't get that intensity signal from people who email you. And so again, I agree, it's a skewed view of your district, and it's a skewed view of your district that in some ways is less useful because it's not even necessarily the intense people who took the time to type up a letter and put a stamp on it once upon a time. It's just people spamming you from who knows where, maybe not even in your district. Now, this has created some, I think, interesting and perhaps positive changes in Congress too. One is that sort of electronic media and electronic fundraising for candidates has allowed backbench members to reach national audiences in ways they never could in the 1980s. And so this disconnect from the district has some negatives, but it also does allow people to become sort of broad policy leaders, not connected just to their geographic representation. The geographic representation is always going to be important for the election. But if you want to go out there and raise money nationally and become invested in a policy, you can collect a constituency for a policy that's not really inside your district. 30 years ago, you want to get on a national policy, you got to like find a way on the Sunday talk shows and like who's going to put a freshman on the Sunday talk shows. Now you go out, raise some money national, you pick up an issue in a policy area, and all of a sudden you can be a leader, at least in the public sphere on that issue, even if it's not connected necessarily to your district. This used to happen once upon a time. Barney Frank on gay issues, or Fulbright on anti-war issues, right? Those sorts of things could happen when you could become sort of national leader. But now it's much more possible for any member to sort of dig in, build a constituency that's not geographic based, and sort of run with it. I don't have strong feelings one way or another on how that affects the institution, but anything that sort of engages backbenchers in the policymaking process, I think is a good thing. So it's not something I worry about.
All right, well, Matt, I'm going to move on to my common questions among all of the interviewees, if you're ready.
Yes.
And this one actually relates quite nicely with the last topic we had, which is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
Yeah, I think that, there's a million definitions of representation, but for me, it's the active participation of elected representatives in the deliberative process, not merely as voting agents, but as transformative builders of policy. And that's sort of a very, that's a pretty strong definition of representation. I think a lot of people would bristle at how much I'm putting on there, but I do think that merely voting or merely being there on behalf of your constituents to sort of vote their interests or voice their interests isn't enough for me. Not because that isn't representation in some democratic sense, but because I don't think it much fits with the form of the legislature in a normative sense, that representing people should be getting in there and actively fighting for their interests in the deliberative process. And so I don't think position taking and voting on things without trying to sort of make things happen is much, it's pretty thin representation. Now, of course, taking position on things does sort of have an effect in theory, but members who, actively participate in the deliberative process of trying to move public policy, to me, that is congressional representation and legislative representation.
So it sounds like, on that spectrum of your district's beliefs versus what you believe are its interests,
yeah,
you're on the interest side of things for the representative. They should think about what they believe the long-term interests are of their constituent, of their district. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly, I don't think members are mere delegates, but even then, like, even if those things are collapsed to the same, even if the interests of the citizens of the district absolutely match their long-term interests, I do think it's incumbent upon the representative to not just be there registering opinions. Congress is a body that does things. It's not a body that just votes on things other people handed them on sheets of paper. And so doing those things of building policy and altering policy, to me, are fundamental process. But absolutely, I take a Burkean view of sort of the role of representative, and that the delegate role has its place. But when things are close, and when the long-term interests greatly deviate from sort of the short-term impulses of the voters, I absolutely believe the role of the politician. Right. I mean, what's the role of a leader in general to me is that leaders, find policy solutions to things and then sell them so that they're politically viable. Right. And so, it doesn't matter if you're the president or a member of Congress. You hear this lament sometimes on the Hill. It's like, oh, I know what the policy solution is, but we'll never sell it. It'll never go. Well, that's fine. Maybe that's true sometimes, but that's not leadership. Right. Political leadership is making things go. okay, by organizing the coalitions and the voters if necessary and persuading them that the right thing to do is also a politically viable thing to do.
Next one is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
So, I can only do this relative to how they allocate their time now. And so definitely more, expertise gaining of individual members and more time spent in committees, particularly on oversight and on the development of bills, more deliberation among alternative ideas. And then, on the other half of this, obviously, less speech making, less news hits, less campaigning. And again, I'm not putting any of these into sort of, practical suggestions because they're very sort of normative, but I think, I do think we spend too little time engaging, members in deliberation and too much time incentivizing them to go raise campaign funds. And that starts with the leadership in the party, right? Like the way they treat the freshmen is basically just tell them you need to go down to the safe houses and spend 4 hours a day dialing for dollars. And I mean, I understand the impulse. You want to win the elections, and I and some of this is intractable and unescapable, but it's a very electoral view of what makes something a democracy. The idea that the way to win is to win elections and get unified control of government, and then implement your party platform. And it's sort of like this self-fulfilling fantasy, because then you do get control, and then you're scared to implement things because you're worried about the next election. But it's a very sort of electoral view of politics, and I think sort of like politics is much more about what happens between the elections, and the fixation on the elections is ultimately bad for governance.
So what about a percentage breakdown of time? Can you do one?
Oh,
Raising money, or, trying to win elections versus legislation versus oversight.
Yeah.
Do you have any categories or numbers you can give?
Yeah, I'm sure. Let's put members in. Let's see. Let's put them in Washington 4 days a week. So that's 4/7 of their time in Washington, and so the other 3/7 they can do campaigning or district outreach or whatever they want. And then when we're in Washington, let's put a imaginary band that actually worked on fundraising while Congress is in session. So you can't be down at the safe houses while we're in session. And there's all sorts of problems with trying to do that, but let's do that. And then so 100% of the time you're in Washington, you're involved somehow in the policy process. So let's put you in committee in the mornings, and let's put you on the floor in the afternoon. So let's put 25% of total time into committee work. Divide that between oversight and policy. So I'll give them 15% of each of those: policy, committee work, and then oversight work in the committee. Those obviously interact. That's 30% of your time. Put them on the floor 20% of the time, and then the rest of the time they can either be in their district or doing whatever in Washington, I would say. I don't necessarily agree with people who want Congress here a ton more. I think they're here. I think they're here plenty. And I do think that the members have an important job to do back in their districts. I don't think that end of the string is unimportant. And obviously the members agree with that too, because a lot of them don't want to be here at all. But I do think when they're in Washington, we do have them trapped in a way that we could probably streamline what they're doing. And we've devised so many features of Congress that cater to sort of the non-deliberative needs of the members. One of them, of course, is a useful tool on the floor, which is stacking all the votes. So once upon a time in the 60s, you had to be near the floor basically all day in the House, because at any moment there could be a roll call vote that came up. And then they came up with this brilliant idea where they would allow the chair to delay the votes. And so now if you look at how the House works, they have votes basically twice a day that they're stacked, where they do all stuff in the afternoon and they delay every vote till 6 o'clock. So if you just want to go vote, you show up at 6. And that frees up the whole rest of your day to go to the safe houses and dial for dollars, or to go meet interest groups downtown. And some of those are good things, right? But it does sort of take sort of the deliberative process on the floor and say, this is not important. Just come down and vote, right? And you will be a vote card is what you are in terms of the floor deliberative process. You have become a vote card. And then something's lost there, right? I'm not saying there's no benefits to this system. Of course there are, but something's lost there. And so maybe we undo that and force members to actually be active participants in the floor, at least in the sense that they're going to have to trudge down there. So they might as well think about it. I can't tell you the number of times stood on the House floor and had members say, wait, what are we voting on here? I mean, just because there's 7 votes in a row and they're just trying to figure out where they are on their palm card that says yes, no, no, yes, no, no, yes.
Well, here's one that I think you'll have something to say about. How should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Well, I mean, I'd like to see, a, a more open process, as we've been talking about this all along. And so, I think sort of, I would like to see more open rules on the floor so that more people have a chance to input ideas. And, you can get really cynical about this fast, that the only thing that's going to be input, right, is that the problem in the system is not sort of the procedurals, it's the inputs of the party system now. And that if you open up the floor rules, all you're going to get is sort of like gotcha amendments of nonsense. And sometimes that's true on high profile stuff, but a lot of times it's not. And when you go to a committee markup, you get some of that. In the committee process, a lot of times the amendment process is more open, and you get some of the gotcha stuff, but you also get like actual substantive, thoughtful, deliberative alternatives introduced that people have to grapple with. And so I would like to see more of that fostered. I would like to see the leadership allow that and not put so much pressure on the rules committee, to bottle up amendments and just and have closed floor votes. I would also like to see more allowance for what comes out of the committee to be what goes on the floor. Too often now we're using the rules committee to alter the bills again, and so what you're getting on the floor is not even what the committee wanted. You're getting what the leadership decided at the rules committee resembled what the committee wanted, and can get to the floor after negotiations with sort of factions there. And sometimes that's for purposes that are just purely political. If you remember when Barbara Lee managed to get a majority to vote to repeal the AUMF in the Appropriations Committee 2 or 3 years ago when the Republicans had control, what they do, they just took it out in the Rules Committee and put a different bill on the floor. And that's fine. In some ways that is a deliberative process. The Rules Committee did it. But I would like to see more willingness to take committee material and let it stand or fall on the floor. The leaders are just absolutely allergic right now to bills failing on the floor. They see it as a reflection of their failure, and that's tough to overcome. And I understand their incentives, but it's not great for sort of deliberative process.
What fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Oh, well, yeah, sure.
If we didn't already hit one of them.
Yeah, sure. Well, certainly, I think that the big imbalance right now is that we've beefed up the executive branch without beefing up Congress in this round of beef ups, right? I always think about sort of the New Deal beef up being in the executive branch being followed by the Congressional Reorganization Act in the 40s, and then the beef up of the executive branch in the 60s, being followed by another congressional Legislative Reorganization Act in 1970, sort of expanding things. And then we had sort of the post 9/11 enhancements of the executive branch without a corresponding enhancement of Congress. And I think it's long overdue that Congress get an update in terms of resources and capacities, and maybe just a basic overhaul of how it's orienting itself. So for sure, I would like to see that more resources to the individual members too, which I think would alleviate some of their sort of strain and willingness to go along with the leadership. And as I talked about at the beginning, we talked about sunset clauses. And I think if 50 years from now we had sort of a default situation where statutory presidential power was sunset, we'd see a stronger Congress with more oversight power. And maybe some of this stuff you can only accomplish when there's an immediate cause. And I don't know what the sort of end of the Trump administration is going to do on this effect, but it certainly raised a lot of issues where people want to reel in presidential power. And if we get reform of the Vacancies Act, and we get reform of the National Emergency Act, and the whatever the Mutual Security Act is that gives the tariff authority, those sorts of things may be a step in the right direction. And sometimes it has to be bad before it gets better. And so maybe we'll get that there.
What book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Probably Senate Syndrome by Stephen Smith. And I say that because it's such a careful procedural history of filibuster reform in the Senate. And the thing it really makes clear is that no one in Congress can really take their normative vision and make it happen, because they, in order to change things, you need to harness short-term impulses of various factions in Congress, and that you're not going to simply come up with a great idea and change Congress because you have a great idea. You also have to have sort of the political will and skill to put together a coalition to change things, and you're going to fail often, right? That any congressional reform project is not a 2-year project. It's a much longer project than that.
Great. So my last question here is about your kind of long-term plans for your research. What do you have in mind, looking at 10, 20 years for yourself and the areas you're working in?
10, 20 years. My gosh. Well, I do, we talked about what I'm researching right now. I do want to write a book in the realm of separation of powers and sort of Congress as an institution within the constitutional system. And that may be a book on the sunsetting provisions writ large, thinking about sunsets as a fundamental legislative tool in the modern era. But it may be something different. I think that, we don't have enough sort of full-throated defenses of Congress. Even people who like Congress tend to be apologists for Congress. And I think finally in Washington, we're seeing in the last 5 or 10 years, a new crop of people who are willing to defend Congress on its own terms and say, no, this is good. And this isn't just something that, is baked in the system that we have to learn to live with, but that this is actually a form of government that makes sense and has its own advantages on its own terms. And so I would like to be part of that kind of crowd because I don't think Congress is sort of a problem that needs to be dealt with. I think it's a good form of government, legislative government, and one that needs to be defended as such.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.